Hello and welcome to the Language Revolution podcast. My name is Cate Hamilton. I'm a languages teacher and founder of Babel Babies. The aim of this podcast is to get people talking about talking. So without further ado, let's get started. So today I'm talking to Thomas Bak, who is a reader in neuroscience at the Edinburgh University. And Thomas, this is our second conversation about languages.
Yes.
In our first, we talked a little bit about how the brain learns languages and whether there's a bilingual advantage. And we touched upon, why we have just organised the International Day of Multilingualism and how multilingual is in fact normal and it is part of human development as a species and perfectly natural thing to do. So in this episode, I'd like to talk about how we do it, how do we learn languages, and is there, Thomas, a perfect age for learning languages?
Well, it depends. It depends at least on two things. Firstly, it depends which aspect of language we are looking at. And secondly, it depends what are you learning languages for.
Okay.
So why you want to
So your
learn
motivation
languages.
and also your...
And also, to say, that's right. So let's start first with the kind of aspects of language. What is probably something which is learned first are the sounds. I mean, that's the first thing that the children listen to before they even understand what it means. So they will have an idea about the melody, about the sounds of the language.
The intonation.
Long intonation, and the sound, the phonemes and so on. Long before there will be much meaning there, and also the emotional value and so on.
Well, and babies can hear during pregnancy.
Exactly.
So from 20 weeks of pregnancy, can't they?
And I don't think that at that time they will really get, all the semantic finesse of our conversation, but they get the sounds, they get the melody, they get the prosody and so on. And that is, of course, the first thing that they produce. I mean, they start producing sounds long before they start producing words, let alone sentences. So in a way, in the acquisition of spoken language, so to say, the sounds come first. And that is the first thing which is learned, and that is something which in a way is indeed easier to learn younger than older. There are some studies suggesting that in a way already at age, as young as maybe 18 months or so, we start losing the ability to distinguish between kind of very, very fine phoneme distinctions. So there was some work done, for instance, with Indian languages which have kind of the opposition between dental and retroflex, so da and da, ta, ta, and so on. And that is something which, so to say, very small babies practically with any language can distinguish, but once they are not, or if they are not exposed to this distinction, it is okay.
When you did that, it was very difficult for me to hear the difference between...
That's right. Well, I'm practicing it, and I still probably don't do it properly.
Yeah, but it's, you can see how if you are not a very young child, say, I've heard that Chinese, you've got the tones, and you've got, say, five tones, is it?
Yeah, I mean, there are four. There are four tones plus a neutral one. So in fact, 5 is correct number.
So one sound. The example my friend gave me was ma, and you can say it can mean horse or mother or marijuana. Or and it depends how you say it.
That's the classical example. But in fact, I mean, there are quite a lot of tonal languages. So I mean, Chinese is by far the best known, but I mean a lot of languages in Southeast Asia, let's say Thai, Burmese, Vietnamese and so on, are tonal languages. Also many languages in Africa, languages in Nigeria, Yoruba, main language of is tonal, I think, as Igala or Igbo probably be tonal as well. And then you have tonal languages in North America, I think, Athabascan language, Navajo and so on. So from this point of view, it's a phenomenon you find across the whole world, although, as I say, Chinese is by far the most famous example. And that is something which in a way is much easier to learn as a child than as an adult.
Because you can finesse, your hearing is just more tuned in.
But also it's not just distinctions between languages, it's also within language. So let's say in most languages in the world, except my own mother tongue, Polish, where there's remarkably little dialect difference within Poland, to a degree that it's difficult for me to recognize where people come from when I meet them, so to say, without knowing them. But in English certainly, but also, let's say, in Spanish, in Italian, in German, and so on, you have big differences in dialect. Now, you will find that it's difficult to produce a different dialect from a certain age. So if you have someone who grows up in Scotland and moves to London, let's say with 20 or so, he or she will probably sound Scottish for the rest of their life, even if they stay in London, and vice versa. If a Londoner moves up to Scotland, will not necessarily sound like Scottish. So I would say this, and what I find absolutely fascinating is the idea that, I mean, let's say this distinction, so to say, until when you can get the sound, you can sound like a native, is of course slightly different. For some people it finishes earlier, for some later. Some people are fantastic in doing it. I mean, there are some comedians, we are here in Edinburgh, we have the famous Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Some comedians are making their money from the ability to imitate different accents and dialects. So they will make a whole story and joke of a Liverpudlian and Mancunian and Cockney Londoner and so on, and a Welshman going and so on. So you have this, but for most people, so to say, I would say the pronunciation becomes crystallized around adolescence, 15, 16, 17,
so
and so
by
on.
the end of puberty, you might struggle to get a native accent.
And the interesting, but also, I mean, native also within the language, not also between languages. And interestingly, this is the period which in many cultures is the period of initiation rites. That's where, so to say, your tribal identity becomes fixed. So whether, if you look, let's say, at religious ceremonies, whether you look at the Catholic confirmation, or at bar mitzvah, or upanayanam, and so on, you have a lot of initiation ceremony, and very often it's not something you do with babies, it's not something you do with adults, it's something you do, so to say, around more or less the time of adolescence. So I would say that the way how we sound is above all our tribal identity.
That's really interesting. So I'm from the Worcestershire, and as I was recording the intro to this podcast, I said podcast because I thought I'd better sound proper. But it didn't feel natural at all. But I went to Oxford University, so I was exposed to more received pronunciation there. And I have never lost the sound. But I say bath and podcast, as I don't actually, I don't say bath. I wouldn't, and that wouldn't occur to me at all. But it's strange. I seem to have a bit of childhood accent and a bit of adulthood accent. And then I lived in Scotland for 8 years, and people sometimes say, "Oh, are you from Edinburgh?" Well, no, I'm not from Edinburgh, but I have a little bit of an Edinburgh twang. And especially if I'm talking to somebody who is Scottish, then it really comes back.
But you see, I mean, that's very...
Is that a natural thing for humans to take on the accent?
Well, it is natural for some people more than for others. And it's very interesting what you say, because very often, I mean, this is not necessarily a conscious process.
No, it just sort of happens. And my Welsh friend, Sarah, when I'm talking to her, I become more and more Welsh.
That's right. So in a way, I mean, it's interesting. I remember once sitting on a train from London to Edinburgh, going via Newcastle, and opposite me was a guy who's kind of spent most of the time on phone, which was kind of pretty annoying. And since I couldn't really quite, I didn't have, my Oropax or so on to put into my ears, I was kind of listening, not really voluntarily. But the interesting thing was, he sounded almost like a Londoner living London. And the closer we came to Newcastle, the more it sounded Geordie. And by the time he came out of Newcastle, it was really... So in a way, some people, you do have those things, and some people are much better in, so to say, adjusting, and very often is unconscious. I have a Spanish friend here who, is incredibly good in picking up not only English but Scottish accent, and she said, when I go to Glasgow, by the evening I come back and I speak with a Glaswegian accent. And I say, well, but how do you do it? And then her answer was, beautifully in Spanish, se me pega, which means it sticks to me. So it's not that I do it, it's something that is happening.
It just sort of comes in.
Absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
By the way, it's fascinating, the way, for instance, in Hindi, how you say whether you speak the language or not is the language coming to you. So in a way, if you ask, I mean, do you, aapko Hindi aati hai? It means, is Hindi coming to you?
Right.
So it's not you going to language,
just
the
the
language
channel.
coming to you, so to say.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Now, so from this point of view, but as I say, as you notice, I mean, there are big differences, and some people retain this ability to adjust much better than others. So what I said is, so that's why I don't think it's really meaningful to speak about critical period as if it were something like, you know, until your 17th birthday
So
you are native speaker,
set
and then
limit.
from tomorrow
Yes.
you lose it.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of individual differences. I mean, let's say it would be very unusual for people, let's say, if they move, for instance, before 15, it would be very unusual for them not to acquire the accent of the new place, and it's relatively unusual for people maybe after 20 or 25 to acquire it. But in between, there is a kind of relatively long.
So you're not going to wake up
time.
one day and the
Exactly.
critical window has
Exactly.
closed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
and then
that's it.
panically you say, "Oh gosh, today the critical window has closed."
Yeah,
That's
okay.
certainly not the case.
So So in terms of sounds, childhood is broadly going to be a fruitful time for learning sounds. So you're going to sound more like a native if you've learned from early.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the other aspects of languages,
Well, I would say with
time?
grammar, I mean, you know, grammar can be learned throughout your life. What happens is, if you learn certain grammar, and by the way, grammar is also a you know, trial and error period, and we know that also native speakers, native speaking children make errors. I mean, a classical example is, let's say in English, they will produce, you know, they say wind instead of won. I mean, I win the game, I eat it.
They say I wented to the park.
Exactly, or, you know, I eat it, you know, all my dinner, and so I think that's something which is well described in English native speakers.
Because we've got such irregular verbs.
Yeah, and
but
then
we also have regular endings, don't we?
Exactly.
And I think children generalise that. They find a rule and they think, oh, I'll apply that rule to everything. Sometimes it's quite funny.
Absolutely, and that happens now. For my daughter, it took a while to kind of realize that in Spanish, for instance, you don't say savo, but you say se. And then, interestingly, she then observed younger children say, oh, she still thinks that you say savo and not se, because she didn't learn it.
She's not
So from this point of view, we learn it. At some point, it becomes automatized. So I think the main difference in grammar probably is that if you are a kind of native speaker, you don't even think about it. Things kind of flow automatically.
Yes.
And that is something which is more difficult for non-native speakers. So let's say in an interview, particularly if I'm tired or so, it can happen to me that sometimes I make grammatical errors which I know are incorrect. A classical example would be past tense. I know, for instance, once you say, you know, did you, you don't put the verb into past tense. So it's not did you knew, but did you know.
Ah, yes.
But it can happen to me that I start saying, oh, did you knew? And the moment when I say this, I already realized that was an error. So the point is, so it's not that I don't have, so to say, the knowledge of it, but it's not automatized. So let's say the form did doesn't automatically suppress the past tense transformation.
But if you've learned from a much younger age, you can just switch between the two grammars or three grammars without showing any cracks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But here, interestingly, that is already different in a... So, for instance, that is an error that I realize I occasionally do, particularly when I'm tired. But, for instance, I would never do it in a written language. Because then I have time, I look at, of course, because I know it's incorrect. So that's why for foreigners, so I would say there is really a kind of, there is a number of different, so first the critical periods are long, they are individually different, and then they are different for different things. So let's say in terms of this automaticity, it's also something that you usually learn maybe around puberty and so on. If you learn language after 20, it will be difficult. But you can learn it to a degree that you will not do these errors, for instance, in the written language, because there you have time, you work, so to say, offline. And that explains, for instance, why people, you know, as you will know, coming from a literature background, there are many people who write wonderful world-class literature in languages which are not their mother tongue. So one example which I particularly like is, of course, Joseph Conrad, or Józef Konrad Korzeniowski, because I went to the same school as him, so I remember in our school aula to see his portrait always
Well, some
in
people
Krakow.
don't even realise that Joseph Conrad is not English.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it was his fifth or sixth language, depending how you count. I mean, he grew in a Polish family, but, you know, first in the part where which was Russian-speaking, where he had to learn Russian at school. Then he was in Krakow, where it was German-speaking, part of Austria, so he had German at school. Then he was enrolled on French ships, where he spoke French. The question, I mean, maybe to what extent he spoke Ukrainian. So English was at least, well, his fifth or sixth language. Yes. Now, I would say his command of English is not bad.
It's not bad.
I mean, no, if that's an ideal, that's not. Yeah. But for instance, he spoke with a very strong accent, as we know from reports, let's say, by Bertrand Russell, who was one of his great admirers. Another good example would be Samuel Beckett, who wrote some of his plays, including the famous Waiting for Godot, or Notre Dame Godot, in French, which was not his first language. So from this point of view, we have nice examples across the whole world of literature of people who reach incredibly good level writing in what is not their native, their first language.
Yes.
It is even more pronounced when it comes, for instance, to understanding the language. So probably the most dramatic example here I can give is Mary Hobson, an English writer who started learning Russian with 56.
I know this story about Mary Hobson. So she had broken her foot, or she was
she was in a hospital.
Laid up, wasn't she, in hospital?
And then her daughter said, brought her a copy of War and Peace and said, "Ma'am, if you don't read it now, you will never do it. Now you have the time."
Yes,
and she liked it so much that she had this mad idea to say, "Well, I want to read it now in original." So she decided to learn Russian.
Because she felt like she was missing some of the nuances.
And she didn't have much, no exposure to Russian at all. With 75, she got, or at the age of 75, she got her PhD with a thesis about Griboyedov.
So she learned Russian in her 50s and 60s.
Exactly.
She
did a PhD about Russian poetry with 75, about Griboyedov, a 19th century Russian writer. And then, with 90, she published a new translation of Yevgeny Onegin, the main work of Russian
when she was 90.
literature.
And she's still alive, I don't know.
And and for me, a kind of dramatic example, I mean, she got, of course, all the kind of Russian literature prizes. Yes. So, I would say her Russian, I mean, in order to translate the main works of Russian literature, her Russian must be quite good. Yes. So, you can learn grammar. I mean, she will be probably not as fast producing correct sentences as someone who learned, but enough to appreciate and render in English translation some of the most beautiful works of Russian literature.
That's it. And I remember reading that she found the process of learning Russian alphabet quite tiring, and that she slowed down in the evenings.
Yes,
exactly. She would take a rest in the evenings. But maybe a child would have energy,
absolutely,
for longer.
Absolutely.
Because I suppose if you're a young child, your job at that point is to understand your world, and you've rapidly got to get into it. As an adult, perhaps our ability to learn. We've not got such stamina, perhaps, but it doesn't mean that we can't.
Absolutely.
Do an incredibly good job. Yeah. So we've talked learning sounds is perhaps easier as a young person, but there's certainly no cut-off point. There's not a definite day when you turn 17 it will end. And we've talked about the grammar that we can learn that throughout life. So what other aspects of
of course, vocabulary is something that we continue learning throughout our lifetime.
Yes.
And in a way, we cannot help but learn new words, particularly in our modern world, because new things are coming up. I mean, technology is a good
because
example.
There are neologisms.
Technology, for instance, when I was growing up in Poland, there was not even things like answer phone, let alone mobile phones, let alone downloading, uploading computer files, let alone internet with Facebook and so on and so on. So languages have to create these new words, and we have to learn them. Now, kind of my favorite example is contactless payment.
Okay.
This is something which practically only appeared in the last 2 years or so, and you can notice in Edinburgh in Polish shops, depending when people came over, whether they know what is the correct new Polish word or not.
Oh, okay.
Because, it is really something which only came up. So it's not completely predictable. In Polish you don't say bezkontaktowy, so without contact, which would be the translation of contact. You say zbliżeniowy, which means basically paying by proximity, by coming close to.
Okay.
So those words are not predictable and they develop. So from this point of view, I think we learn vocabulary all our lives, and that explains, for instance, why very often if we study in a certain language, we might find it difficult, for instance, to give a talk about it in our mother tongue.
Right.
So
yes.
for me, I would say it's much easier to speak about all professional things or do an interview like this one, I mean, in English anyway, but I would say even it's easier probably in Spanish and in German than it's in Polish. I mean, I did interviews in Polish, but I had to struggle quite a bit because it's not a vocabulary that I really have. I left Poland with 17, so most of my university time was already in Germany.
Yes.
Practically most of my professional time was in Britain. So from this point of view, I don't really have a lot, or at least these items are not immediately available.
I've had that discussion with a Lithuanian friend of mine who said that she was, going to determined to speak Lithuanian with her baby when he was born, but then she'd been in England for 20 years, and suddenly she'd left Lithuania when she was 18. And she just didn't have the right words to say to him, you know, all the comforting sort of, all the nappies, all the pushchairs, and so she just felt like she had to suddenly learn a whole new list of vocabulary in her own language.
That is true, that is true. So I would say a kind of
I mean, we do that anyway when we have a child, because you don't know.
I mean, if you don't have a child, you don't have the vocabulary about, nappy changing and so on and so on. Absolutely. And by the way, the word for nappy will be different in US and in Britain. So in a way, so you have also differences. I think I don't know, the Americans say diaper, exactly.
That's it. So vocabulary we learn throughout life. So children obviously start off with a smaller vocabulary. They have, maybe 30, 50 words, and it grows and grows.
It's a lifelong process.
Well, it is.
And very often our vocabulary will be best in a language, I mean, let's say, will depend on the context and will depend what we learn in it. So let's say for me, I would say my emotional and family vocabulary is mainly Polish and Spanish, whereas my intellectual, professional vocabulary is mainly German and English.
Because that's where you studied medicine.
Exactly.
Great, so let's just think about the benefits of bilingualism for your brain's health, because I know this is a big topic of yours, having a healthy linguistic diet, and I quite like this idea that it's actually a choice that you can make for a healthy lifestyle. Learning languages is part of that. So how is it that speaking more than one language has advantages for your brain's health?
Well, let me now link it to the very first question that you asked about the kind of critical periods and so on. And I said that it depends on aspect of language, and we are kind of nicely going now through the
three
aspects.
We
learn three aspects of
sounds
languages.
And grammar and vocabulary. Yes.
But if we see learning languages not just as something we do because we want to learn a language to communicate, but also as something we want to do as a mental exercise, then I would almost say the later we do in life, the better.
Okay.
And here the point is, as you noticed already from the first interview, I like to compare it, or a mental and linguistic experience, to physical one.
Yes.
Coming from medical background, for me it's all parts, so to say, of the same phenomenon, same system. Now, if you want, let's say, to learn tennis because you want to win Wimbledon, then you'd rather do it very young.
So if you're going to be a champion tennis player,
if you want to be a champion, then you start young. Also, if you want to learn piano in order to perform at Carnegie Hall, then you'd rather learn it very fast as well.
Yes.
However, if you, for instance, want to play tennis because you want to keep fit, then in fact it's more important what you do with 15 and 16, what you do as a teenager.
So so if your motivation for learning tennis is to win a Grand Slam, you're not going to start when you're 50 and then win a Grand Slam. But if you want to be healthy and be fitter, then it's best to be doing the tennis when you're 50.
Exactly.
Because I guess if you did tennis as a young person and then didn't do tennis for decades, you're not going to carry on the benefit of having done a lot of tennis early on.
Not for a long time. So people who, let's say, if you are very active, sporty and whatever, have healthy lifestyle in your teenage years, and then spend the following 50 years doing all the unhealthy things, then you will not end up as a very healthy
No, it's no
septuagenarian.
good being a fast runner when you were 8.
Exactly,
If you don't,
exactly that.
not going to
And
do
you
anything
know,
in the meantime.
so from this point of view, I mean, if we see languages, and that's a perspective which is of course very important for me and my research, if we see languages not just as a means of communication, but also as a mental exercise,
Yeah.
then what we do later is more important than what we do earlier. So from this point of view, I'm particularly interested, exactly in examples I had, like, you know, Mary Hobson, I'm particularly interested in people learning languages later on. And by the way, coming back to another topic that we mentioned in the first interview, we spoke about linguistic exogamy and societies in which it's usual to marry someone speaking a different language. That means that it's not only usual for children to grow up with 2 different languages, it is expected from an adult to be able to learn a new language.
Yes.
And that is something, so I would say it is equally natural for us to learn languages as children as to learn languages as adults. There are different, so to say, advantages and disadvantages in both, but we can do both.
Yes, exactly. And we might bring different skills to the process as well.
Absolutely.
As you know, a baby is not going to sit with a dictionary, and an adult can use different skills for that. So, a really hot topic when we talk about Thomas Bak is dementia, and how languages are an important, maybe a tool, or almost not a medicine, but like a care mechanism. How would you describe?
Yeah, well, I think in order probably to explain all this field, it might be good to start with introducing a very important influential concept that we have nowadays, and that is of cognitive reserve.
Cognitive reserve.
Now, the origin of this is going back again. It's a kind of nice bridge to what we were speaking in the beginning about different methods and so on that we have in neuroscience. Now, the development of neuroimaging in neuroscience brought a lot of new insights, but it brought also some, I would say, unexpected, or for some people at least surprising results. Namely, that there is no one-to-one complete overlap between what we see on the scans and what we see in real life.
Okay.
This is not only in terms of the brain. So a nice example, or clear example, would be, for instance, the issue of, let's say, back pain and MRI of the spine. You can have people who have quite a pronounced disc prolapse and are still functioning quite well, although you look at their scans and say, oh gosh, that looks really problematic. And you have some who will have much less on the scan, but are in a wheelchair with chronic pain. So we cannot really predict, we cannot sort of say, you know, 1 millimeter means so much pain and so on and so on. There must be other factors which modulate it.
That's right.
And the same we can find in the brain. Of course, people who have more atrophy, so more loss of brain substance, are likely to perform worse on cognitive tests and maybe in real life. But again, it's not a one-to-one relationship.
So the curve is not,
you find
the
sometimes
more brain
people,
damage you have, the more symptoms.
You have, I mean, you have a progression of symptoms which go together with atrophy. But you can see sometimes people who have quite a lot of atrophy and are still functioning remarkably well, and others who are dysfunctioning with less atrophy. So again, it's not that atrophy doesn't matter, it matters a lot. It explains what we would say a lot of variance, but it's not the only factor. There must be other factors which modulate this relationship, which also play a role. And in this context, the concept of cognitive reserve emerged. So the idea is that if we have, so to say, well-connected brain, well-trained, exercised brain, it might be able to cope with pathological processes better than one which is more ill-equipped.
Okay, so so when you say a pathological process, what do you mean?
Atrophy, for instance, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and so on. So the idea is that, so to say, having a better cognitive reserve, be it through being multilingual or being through having a kind of cognitively demanding occupation or being active in some other ways, that means you will get the pathology, you will get the atrophy, you will get the cell loss, like patients who have, other patients who have the disease, but your brain will be able to compensate it.
So you won't
for
show the
slightly
effects
longer.
of it?
So the effects will come later.
Okay.
So it means, and that's a very, very important point, because there are a lot of misinterpretations, so to say. People saying, oh, well, if you are bilingual, multilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's disease. I mean, I wish that were the case.
Yeah.
It's not. What you can see is a delay. So that means you can still get the pathology, but the pathology will be compensated, will show its effect later.
Okay, so you're still going to, you're still prone to having a stroke.
Well, I mean, stroke is a brilliant example, because, I mean, in stroke, in a way, it's even easier, because in stroke we have the event, which we usually know exactly when it is. Most patients will get a scan, so you see exactly what's happening, and then hopefully you start recovering.
Yes.
And what we found is there was no difference whatsoever in the age of stroke between people who spoke more than one language or only one language.
So being multilingual
doesn't stop you at all.
No.
Unfortunately,
Yes.
there are many other things maybe you can do, healthy diet or movement and so on, exercise,
yes.
absolutely. So in a way, the age, I mean, in the study, again, done with my colleague Suvarna Alladi in Hyderabad in India, we found exactly, it was kind of less than half a year difference between both groups. However, once you get a stroke, people who spoke more than one language recovered better.
So a better recovery rate.
So that means it's not about being generally healthier or having a better diet, having generally healthy lifestyle and so on. That didn't influence the age of stroke at all.
Yeah.
But what bilingualism influenced was the recovery. So there was a much better recovery, twice as much.
Twice?
So in fact,
Wow.
I mean, normal cognition after stroke was noted in more than 40% of bilinguals and multilinguals, and less than 20% of monolinguals.
Wow, that's double.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so if
it was a massive difference.
That's a massive difference. That's really important. So if I just understand this right, so if you speak more than one language, you actually double your chances of
recovering
a full recovery from stroke.
Or at least it will be faster. I mean, the point is, I mean, we didn't really, I mean, again, we looked roughly 1 year later.
Yeah.
If we maybe looked for 5 or 10 years, you will find a picture probably exactly opposite to the one I said with Alzheimer's. So you will find probably that people who spoke one language did recover, but much slower than those who spoke more.
Okay, that's absolutely amazing. So should the NHS be prescribing languages for people?
Well,
I mean, is it
in a way,
better than drugs? I mean,
I would say well. I mean, it seems to work better than any drugs that we have available. It's certainly much cheaper.
Yes.
It might have many other advantages. I mean, we are not speaking. I mean, we are speaking only about the cognitive advantage. But for instance, one of the great advantages of language courses is that it's also a way of getting people into social interaction.
Well, yes, exactly, because another problem of old age is loneliness.
Exactly,
isn't it?
absolutely.
So if you, but say you signed up for a Italian class or something, is it better to do every Tuesday over a number of years, or is it better to go for a week-long intensive Italian course in Italy? And if you do the week-long intensive, is that useful? Or
that's a very good question, and the answer is we don't really have that much evidence. It's an area which I find particularly interesting because it's exactly an area where, coming from medicine, I see or I think in terms of the dose and treatment period.
Okay.
It's a very different approach to, let's say, people coming from more linguistic tradition who see languages more as a kind of dichotomous. You have the competence or you don't have the competence.
Okay, you can do it or you can't.
Exactly. So in a way they dichotomize. Now for me, language is an activity, let's say like swimming.
Yes.
And from this point of view, if I want to find out whether swimming is healthy, I'm not interested whether people can swim or how beautiful their crowd movements are, but I look, for how often they swim, for how much time, and so on and so on. So I see language as practical activity.
Okay, like Sudoku?
Like anything else. Yeah. The difference between Sudoku and language is that Sudoku is relatively so to say, circumscribed in what you do, and generally many of those type also, crosswords and so on methods, there is very little generalization. So that means you are getting better in what you are doing, but it doesn't really change very much your other functions.
Doesn't have a sort of a knock-on benefit effect.
And I think this is probably because it's very, very circumscribed. Now, language learning is for me something which affects enormous number of different things. I mean, we have the perception, we spoke about sounds and so on. We have this perception and production of sounds.
Yes.
We have different rules of grammar, which can be sometimes, almost like mathematical algorithms. We have different semantics, different meaning of words, shades of meaning. We have different social rules, which kind of words or style and so on you use with which person. So
registers and
exactly.
all that, yeah.
So from this point of view, I would say, I mean, Sudoku or as a crossword is for me like going to a gym and spending all your time in one machine. Probably, if you train biceps all the time, your biceps will get stronger, but you will not necessarily become a very fit person. Going to a language course is like going through a kind of parkour of 10 or 15 machines, which really affect different.
So it gives your whole brain a workout.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I would not say that language is completely unique. What is probably closest to that, I would say, is music.
Yes.
Because in case of music, you also have different levels. You have also the perception and production of sounds.
Yes.
You have also rules, which can be very mathematical, but you have all the emotional aspects as well. And then, if you perform music with other people, let's say in an orchestra, in choir, and so on, you have the social aspect as well. So that's why, in a way, I would expect language and music to have quite similar effects, because in both cases they offer really a very rounded, so to say, involvement of a lot of different brain domains.
So it's basically a really great workout for your brain, and you can delay dementia up to 4 years, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there are several studies showing 4 years. In illiterates, it was even 6 years.
In illiterates,
so,
right.
Yeah, okay. So that was a bigger difference than literate people. So I think it's I mean, I say much more than any of the drugs that we have available.
Okay, and you double your chances of recovering from a stroke with your full brain function. So it's just absolutely wonderful, isn't it? And so is that just if you've learned languages your whole life? I mean, if you're sort of 65 now, yes, you can start learning Italian. So my parents, they learned Italian in their 60s into the early 70s, and they're really good at it now. Is it more challenging to them? Is it the fact that it's challenging that? Well, I mean, they found it hard. It's tiring. They get very tired talking Italian.
Of course, it's more challenging.
Is that actually part of the?
But I mean, but the
part of the benefit.
But that's a very, very good point. I think you're absolutely right, spot on. Now, we have sometimes the idea that all the learning should be easy and without effort and so on and so on. But in fact, effort might be the part of the deal.
Yes.
So, of course, if you learn things later, and it's not only with languages, if I want now to learn to play piano, I will find it much more difficult than my 6-year-old daughter. Yeah. If I want now to learn tennis, it will be the same, and so on. So I would say any activity learned later will probably need, so to say, more effort. But that's exactly the reason why we need
exactly. So running is harder if you are not used to it, but
but
you're going to get a lot better at it.
That's exactly what you need. Yeah. I think what happens very often in our lives is that the older we get, the more we get into routines.
That's it. So it's very common, isn't it, that if you have retired, that people can die within a few years of retirement.
A lot of this might be also psychological. Many people, for instance, the moment they retire, they feel that they lost, so to say, the right to live, that they are now burden on society and so on, not contributing and so on. So it can affect the self-esteem, the feeling of worth, of value, and so on and so on. So there's a very, very complex problem involving a lot of things. But of course, another is that, in a way, if you work, a lot of activities are kind of done for you, and also a lot of social life. I mean, whether you like your work colleagues or not, at least you are usually going and you are seeing them and so on and so on. Now, once you stop at home, then that is all gone.
Yeah.
In former times, for instance, going shopping was at least a social interaction. Now, as more and more cases are being now replaced by automatic ones, I mean, even then, this also disappears. So in a
you
way,
just get your shopping delivered. And
exactly, or you get it delivered. So from this point of view, I would say the necessity of social interactions going down, but so the necessity in order to survive, but probably not our desire and our need, and so to say our psychological necessity. So in a way, we are here confronted with something very similar as we spoke in the first episode about the kind of compensation. I would say our natural life, social life, was a lot of physical exercise,
yes,
a lot of mental exercise with multilingualism playing a prominent role, and of course a lot of social interaction.
Yes.
You go hunting together and
yes,
so on.
you live in a tribe. So
what our civilization is doing is to make many of those things superfluous or not necessary.
Yes, or automate the processes.
Exactly. But it doesn't mean that we don't need them. It just means that we have, so to say, now to compensate. So, since we don't have our hunting society, we then have to go to a social club or have social media and so on and so on. So we have to consciously replace things that have been
just because it can
before.
be automated.
Exactly.
So just because you can type into Google how to say hello in Swedish doesn't mean that you shouldn't make the effort to learn how to say hello in Spanish or Swedish if you're going to that country, or just because the easy way is there and you can all do your shopping, it doesn't mean that physically and mentally we don't need to.
Easy
to put
is
the
not
effort in.
always the best way. So one of the metaphors I was using, in a letter to Guardian last year was, in fact, comparing learning languages to hill walking, to climbing a mountain. And I said there are different ways how you can climb a mountain. You can go into a cable car and then you arrive on the top and then you can take your selfie and go back, or you can do a trip, you plan your trip, you go through the landscape and so on. Much longer, much more effortful. But I would say firstly you get physical exercise that you don't get just by using a cable car. But you also learn many other skills. You learn navigational skills, you get a completely different feeling of the landscape. So in a way, I would say with languages like this as well, you can kind of get your Google translation and so on, which would be probably the kind of the equivalent of taking a cable car, but that means that you are depriving yourself of all the important experiences that you can have by taking the way out.
Exactly,
yourself.
the benefit of going up the hill is deprived of half of the things.
Exactly.
So that's brilliant, isn't it? Fascinating. Thank you. I've got one more question. So, talking about people who've perhaps got Alzheimer's already. Okay. Would you recommend that we can sort of learn languages? Say, my older relatives. Can I introduce them to languages?
I would say definitely. I mean, that's one of the kind of ethics of Lingua Flamingo. They try to offer it even to patients with dementia. So far, we don't really have good data. We don't know whether this can in any way help or not. There are reasons which are kind of relatively complicated. Like sometimes if you delay onset of disease, once you get a disease, you can even have a faster sort of deterioration because you have kind of postponed this moment. So at the moment we don't really have cognitive data that would show that this really helps cognitively. However, it could be the case, it certainly doesn't cause any harm, and we know from our pilot studies that, as I say, no one got really confused. What we can tell already now is that there are definitely psychological benefits. So if you have, for instance, people with, let's say, early diagnosis of dementia, one of the first things that happens is very often they move into a feeling of resignation, of nihilism. Oh gosh, from now on I can't learn anything, I can't do anything, and so on and so on.
So it's a sort of a self-perpetuating thing.
Exactly,
silly me,
exactly
lost this
that. So in addition to the pathological process of brain atrophy and so on that they already have, they will have, so to say, an additional inactivity caused by their
They will actually be
resignation.
self-limiting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, if we can counteract it by giving them something that they see they can still do, it can be a very empowering effect. And in fact, in our studies, it was amazing how people in our focus groups at the end said, I'm so proud of myself, I will tell it to my grandchildren, I could learn some Italian, and so on, so on. And as I say, and the second point is also it brings then people together with the social benefits. So I would say from this point of view, it is something which, I mean, I have never seen any side effects. So in a way, if you work with drugs, you expect always that whatever works will have some side effects. I would say side effects of learning language are minimal. So we know
perhaps
it's a very safe
a certain
method.
Wanderlust.
Yeah.
It might encourage you to want to travel.
That's right,
it's
which,
not a
which,
bad
which
side
can ruin you. But I mean, in a way, it's probably not a bad thing. So in fact,
it's better than many sort of other side effects like hair loss or.
Absolutely. I would say probably yes. So from this point of view, I think I'm moving now. I mean, as much as I'm interested in the cognitive aspects, we should not really worship the cognitive or frontal executive functions and so on as the only thing that matters.
You can't separate the brain from the whole being.
I mean, in a way, if you've been working in dementia, I've been working with dementia patients for several decades, there is no alternative to taking what we call biopsychosocial model. So of course biology is important, because in a way these are the processes that cause the diseases. They might hopefully be influenced by some drugs in future and so on and so on. So in a way you can't really do dementia with biology. You can't do dementia also without the psychology of the person, because people might react in a very different way to the same things. And the social, you can't do it really without realizing the social context. Here we have situations, for instance, I was speaking many times about India, where I did quite a lot of work, and I'm really fortunate to have wonderful collaborations with Indian colleagues. And one of the things they would say, I mean, for instance, many families in India, the older people will be living with the family. Now, even if they are forgetful, let's say in the West, if they are living alone and they cannot pay the bills, that's the end. If you live, so to say, with your family in India, you don't pay the bills because of your family. So in a way, the way how society copes with that can be very different. It's not only, I don't want to idealize, so to say, those societies, because for instance, the tensions caused by behavioral changes can be in fact bigger. So if you live together, if you are, so to say, if you live alone and you behave a little bit odd, people will maybe smile and laugh about it, but it doesn't matter. If you live very close together with your family, odd behavior might be much more source of tension. So what I mean is, not that there is some kind of ideal solution and so on, but that we cannot really understand dementia without taking into account the whole all the way from biology through individual psychological development of a person to the social context and the society in which it happens.
Great, and what we're saying is that languages can be a really helpful part of that.
Absolutely.
Treatment.
Absolutely.
And just to summarise this episode, we can start learning languages. Well, we start learning before birth, don't we? We're, in utero, and we can continue learning very successfully throughout the whole lifespan. And there's no reason not to start straight away, whatever age we are.
Absolutely, I would say that is true. What you said, of course, is true for any type of learning. I mean, it's very important to realize, and that is now a bigger and bigger topic, of course, as more and more people are getting older. We spent percentually longer and longer part of our life in retirement, because retirement hasn't changed, but life expectancy is growing. So in a way,
I think doubled in 150 years.
So the importance of lifelong learning is absolutely crucial. And one kind of anecdote which for me kind of summarizes it is, I once took my daughter, who was on holiday that day, into a Swahili class I was doing, and she was kind of behaving very well. I mean, didn't really disturb. And then, after we finished, and we had people, from, let's say, 20s to 70s in age-wise in the class, we're going out, and she said, "Oh, that was interesting, Daddy. So I see grown-ups learn too."
Oh, that's nice.
And loved it, because I think in a way that's a kind of such a lovely
it's
motto.
such a good model, exactly. Grown-ups learn too.
Grown-ups too, and I think it makes, by the way, learning for children more attractive, because they realize it's not something I have to do because I'm a child and once I am grown up I can throw it away. But I would say this should be a life motto for all of us, not only for languages but for everything else.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, and we will speak again in our next episode.
Thanks.